Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis on how it impacts your school community. Plus, we're talking about the mental health modernization plan, a piece of legislation that could drastically impact mental health funding for children. We'll talk about that plan and what happened in the state capitol yesterday.
The ACSA legislative lunch break starts now.
And it is just after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, along with Dr. Edgar Zazwata, ACSA's executive director. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA's senior director of marketing and communications. Welcome here on a Wednesday. We're honored to have you with us. Go ahead and jump into the chat and say hello. Let us know where you're watching from today. Edgar, how are you?
Good, Naj. I'm having a good week. As Neri pointed out, one of the things that obviously was on our mind here this week going into the weekend is just how things would be faring here after. I know it was a kind of a interesting weekend, especially for our folks, our friends down in Southern California. Not every day we're talking about a hurricane or tropical storm. And as Neri pointed out, just thankful that for the most part, and that's not to underscore, there was definitely some areas that were impacted, had to deal with some flooding. But given some of our fears of how this was going to impact some of our communities, I know we had a number of districts that had to change course and canceled classes there to try to just keep our folks safe. But by all accounts, it seems like we fared fairly well, even though we're not a state that deals with that type of weather on the regular basis. I know our folks in LA, there was some interesting content there online. I don't know how many times people texted me the picture of Dodger Stadium being flooded. They knew that would have a personal impact on me. Ended up being somewhat fake news there. It wasn't really flooded. It was a
Wait a minute, it really wasn't flooded? Because
flooded. It was LA Times even had to do a story on that it was an optical illusion. It was like, if those have been to Dodger Stadium, it's on a hill. It'd be very hard for it to just be standing water there, right? It was just how the picture was taken, and it looked like it was water glimmering off the asphalt that made it look like it was flooded, right? The outside. Luckily, the Dodgers there and it had some fun with it. It said, hey, I know we're trending here. And then they showed a picture of a beautiful, landscape after the storm had passed and everything was dry. The field and the parking lots, everything was intact. And, so that just being one of the examples. Obviously, our focus wasn't just Dodger Stadium, but I think it was the thing that got the symbolism of what could have been there. But just thankful that most of our folks were relatively okay, given some of the storms that they had to face here this week.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that so many people are safe. I admittedly, as a San Francisco Giants fan, disappointed that Dodger Stadium was not really underwater. That really would have added to the whole experience of being a Giants fan. So,
the only people underwater right now is the Giants, given their
here we go. And folks, we haven't even gotten into college football yet, as this is week 0, but at some point I believe we probably will. Neri Pais is with us today, Mark Campbell with us, Grant Bennett. Good to have all of you there. Maureen Burness. So many of you here with us today. Honored to have you. We are going to talk about that mental health modernization plan that is in the Capitol right now. Had a big hearing yesterday, had a hearing exactly 1 week ago. We're going to talk with one of the child advocates who's out there speaking on behalf of students and mental health services, coming up in just a couple of moments. First, Edgar, I want to tackle a couple of news headlines, and I'll also get your feedback on something. We've talked about this over in a number of school districts over the past few weeks about what's happening with the changing privacy policies with respect to students who change their identities or their genders on official school records, and new policies in some districts that are requiring notification of parents. Now, this effort has found its way to yet another school district, this time in Orange Unified. An item is being brought forward by 2 board members and is scheduled for a vote as early as next month. Now, according to an article, this is in the Voice of OC, quote, One of those board members says that the policy is important to help protect children from suicide or self-harm, since children that identify as transgender are more likely to suffer from suicidal ideation. The same board member says that, quote, a parent is a child's best advocate, and goes on to say, quote, if we can save children from suicide by bringing their parents alongside them, I think it's a great idea. Now, something that we have not necessarily heard is the comments, if you will, from those who are supporting student privacy, Edgar. And the quote came in from another board member who brought up three concerns with this policy change or proposed policy change, including targeting and discriminating of trans and non-binary students, potential litigation, and, quote, blatant government interference in the family unit that this mandates. So obviously, Edgar, we talked so much about this, but we'll certainly keep an eye on this situation. Let me flip something over really quick to a positive story. This one out of Palo Alto and the Bay Area. This story from EdSource: construction now underway on a 110-unit affordable housing complex for teachers and staff in Palo Alto. The complex will include 3 different types of apartments for teachers, and rent will be at 60% to 140% of the area's median outcome. 4 districts in Santa Clara County: Palo Alto Unified, Los Altos, Mountain View Weissman, as well as Foothill De Anza Community College District are contributing funding to this development, and teachers and school employees will be eligible to apply. So that is a great way, pardon me, for districts to be able to addressing some of those teacher shortages and the housing crisis for teachers. And then, Edgar, you and I were talking this morning. We're getting some feedback from out in the field about the rise in COVID cases, and is there any potential for any state-directed responses from districts, and is there even an appetite for that kind of thing? I know you've been making calls, you've been hearing from the administrators. What are you hearing with regard to this?
Well, first of all, when we were having this conversation this morning over the last couple of weeks, I'm not gonna lie, I was having PTSD. I was like, oh no, here we go again. Of having, not because, and I'll get to that point, not because we feel anything is pending. It's just like, are we here again where we're fielding these questions? When's the last time we even talked about COVID, right? Like on this show and just in general. But obviously, as we've seen, I mean, it just coming off of the summer busy season, travel and whatnot. I'm sure we all know somebody in our immediate circle who maybe had the second or third round of the virus here recently. So it has spawned, interestingly enough, a lot of this questions from our members. And sometimes, you almost have to question, where's the origin of this coming from, in terms of people asking, hey, we think that maybe they're just curious, or they've heard a rumor that like the state may be thinking about mask mandates or shutdowns. And so let me just be very clear. One, we've heard none of that, right? We've heard none of that, to the credit the administration when they're thinking about things, and we're going to be in communication within days to come. So I want to make clear that there's been no talk of that. Frankly, I know what their standard answer is because we've had this conversation with them hundreds of times now over the last number of years. They're always monitoring the health situation, right? And things are always going to be on the table. But I have to say, I think it'd be pretty far-fetched to think that now things are going to go back down that line, while they're always going to keep safety at the forefront and think about what mitigation efforts and, the public health recommendations are still there. They haven't gone away, that if people are suffering from COVID, that like masking up is still a good mitigation. Here's the thing. So that's the health side. Let me talk politics for a second, right? And this is Edgar's analysis. This is not coming from the governor's office. This is just Edgar. This is ACSA. This is Edgar's talking here.
Yeah.
Like, I think in this political environment, what we just talked about, the culture war issues, some of those issues from some of these organized groups, that really the origin of that wasn't everything we're talking about now. It's really started with some of the pushback against some of the measures against COVID. I find it really hard to believe that the state would have the appetite to go in that direction. Not to say that when it's warranted and when public safety is when those mitigation efforts are necessary, they'll go there. But just, I don't foresee us going down that pathway. We'll keep talking to them. If the situation continues to rise in terms of cases, I'm sure they'll have to address that I don't foresee any of that happening. It's part of life now. We're going to go through these ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
I'm sure here in a few months, come holiday season, we're going to be talking about a spike in cases, undoubtedly.
Yeah, I can almost bet that we're going to be hearing about a rise in cases coming up near the holidays. But yeah, we'll continue to follow that. Let's switch topics here because today we're going to be digging into the Mental Health Services Act and the Newsom administration's effort to modernize that after 20 years. So let me just summarize it for you. The modernization would change the funding pathway for mental health services for children up to the age of 25, which stands to have a big impact on the students in your community. Yesterday, we had 6 hours of a public hearing, and the Assembly Health Committee voted 11-0 in favor of the proposal. Now, ACSA has been part of a very close partnership with nonpartisan children now, and a number of education and child advocacy groups around this proposal in the last few months. And actually, in the last 2 weeks, a coalition of 300 groups, including ACSA, sent a letter to the governor, to lawmakers out there, urging them to continue funding programs that are targeting those children up to the age of 25. So let's go ahead and bring our guest from Children now. LaShawn Francis is the Director of Behavioral Health at Children now. LaShawn, it's great to have you here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Welcome. I just gave a few details. You're an expert in the field on this. Walk us through the Mental Health Services Act and why the push to modernize it after 20 years.
No, thank you so much for having me, Naj and Edgar. Really happy to be here. So a few things. One, we never refer to it as a modernization. I know that's the administration's language, but we actually see this as taking a couple steps backwards as it pertains to mental health. I think the feeling is that after 20 years, there are a number of issues that California is facing, mainly homelessness, and I'll even quantify that and say really visible homelessness, that the administration is feeling a lot of pressure to address. And so that's the proposal that you see in front of you. It actually takes about a third of what we all know today as the Mental Health Services Act and reroutes those dollars into housing and housing supports. So that's the biggest change, because what it does ultimately is, since the state is not actually increasing the tax, and as many of you know, it's a 1% tax on personal incomes of $1 million or more, there's no actual increase in the tax. So what it's essentially doing is reducing the ability to spend dollars on mental health services outside of the housing bucket.
LaShawn, thanks for being here, first of all, and making some sense of like this topic. I know we've talked so much over the last number of years about the importance of mental health and how this is a growing need in our schools. I mean, you can't really go to a group of administrators without this coming up as one of the priorities. And I know sometimes these legislative issues, especially some of these weedy technical issues, get kind of lost in the shuffle. So we've appreciated your support, your organization's support of really putting a spotlight on this. And I know our teams have been working closely together, hence why we decided to maybe elevate the attention of this through the op-ed that Naj referenced. So just appreciate your support on that. Going back to this legislative vehicle, we know a lot has happened in the last 2 weeks. So it was kind of this is what led us to go and try to do an op-ed, because we were concerned about where this was going. I know since then, the legislative analysts put out a brief, affirmed some of the points we made there. The administration, the governor's administration, did present some amendments. There was some changes. There was a hearing there where I know that some of this was discussed. All that to say, what changed? I know we talked a little bit about this to our viewers some weeks ago and kind of the problem. I know this issue has evolved. What are maybe some of the positives that have come out of just the latest discussions?
Well, let me actually go back to the month of March. So in March, the governor announced this plan, right, to update the Mental Health Services Act. And the first thing that we noticed was that there was very little mention of children, and especially not with what we know about the youth mental health emergency. We immediately started raising the alarm and saying, hey, whatever language, whatever plan you put together has to include kids. And, frankly, I think the administration listened. And then when the language came out, we realized that unfortunately they weren't listening hard enough. So today with the Mental Health Services Act, we have a bucket called prevention and early intervention. And in that bucket, there's regulatory code that requires counties to spend 51% of the prevention and early intervention dollars on youth 25 and under. That was stripped from the language. So through our efforts, including with help from ACSA, thank you so much, we were actually able to get the state to rethink that and put the requirement back in that 51% of prevention and early intervention dollars be spent on children. I will know that one of the biggest differences, though, with this new prevention and early intervention pot is that the state has since split them. So it's no longer one pot of prevention and early intervention, it's two. One pot is prevention, 4% of the Service Act dollars will go to prevention, and the state will control those dollars, specifically the Department of Public Health. The other pot is called, I think, a behavioral health supports and services pot, and a portion of that will be for earlier intervention, and a portion of that will be for kids, right? So really what we're seeing here with the new amendments is that they have essentially made children whole and kept the status quo of what is currently happening with the MHSA, and making sure that any new changes don't negatively impact the current PEI dollars that are going to kids.
LaShawn, if I could ask a follow-up. So obviously there's been some movement there. What would you say, what are still the areas for opportunities for improvement? Where can this get better in terms of how we're following this whole effort?
Yes, so there are a few things, right? We want to make sure that there's proper representation at the local level for education officials, for example, like yourselves, to be able to look at how counties and advise counties on where dollars should go. We want to make sure that if the state is going to spend a third of the dollars on homelessness, that a portion of those dollars have to be for youth, because young people experience homelessness differently. So you can't have the same interventions for adults as you have for young folks. And then we also want to make sure that the full service partnership bucket of funds, which have always existed and we've been really big fans of, it is what we describe as an anything goes approach. So whatever the client needs, you pay for. Right now, about 50% of the population within FSP are young people. So we want to make sure that with the added pressures that the initiative is getting, the housing pressure, the new substance use disorder pressure added to it, that we're not leaving kids out of the conversation. So we're still asking for a set aside for that. And then finally, within the prevention and early intervention bucket, we know that many times small children ages 0 to 5 get left out of the conversation. So we really want to see a set aside for that as well.
LaShawn Francis is the Director of Behavioral Health at Children Now. If you have any questions for LaShawn, go ahead and put those into the chat. I want to take us back really quick, LaShawn, because while we were at that height of COVID and the virtual learning, we spent a lot of time on this show talking about how there was some confusion between virtual learning and independent study and how they were not the same thing. They were two completely different things. You were in that hearing yesterday, 6 hours. The committee ended up voting 11-0 to move this modernization plan, as the administration calls it. Were you surprised by the vote, and did it give you any insight into the understanding or engagement that our lawmakers have in this particular piece of legislation?
I was not surprised by the vote. I think the lawmakers are really feeling pressure to support this because everyone knows that we have a visible homelessness problem, and no one wants to say that they didn't do everything that they can to, to support solutions to that problem, right? I will say about the 11-0 vote, 2 of those votes were courtesy votes, right? So the next step in the process is for this bill to go to the floor. And that's when we'll have an opportunity for all assembly members to vote on this bill. And those courtesy votes really said, we have major concerns, but we understand that this is a Democratic governor. We understand that our chair of Assembly Health likes this bill and supports this bill. So we're giving this vote, an I vote, as a courtesy, but when it gets to the floor, we can't guarantee that that's what we'll do. So that's what happened yesterday.
LaShawn, you just talked a little bit about, kind of the next steps in the process, and I'll kind of I'll have you reiterate that. And one interesting thing that come to know, you talk about kind of the challenge of how we started this conversation is we get it. And I think for all of us, especially in the education community, we don't discount some of the really the societal ills, the challenges we have, right? Our unhoused population is something that we're all focused on. And we do think that there needs to be some solutions there. I think the challenge here now is at what expense? Given what we've talked about, there is such a need. So how do we, what do we need to do on that? And in terms of all of us, you're talking to an audience, I think generally would agree, because that we're all in the education business. But one, what comes next? What is the best way for us, not just even on this bill, but I mean, there was so much there. You don't find a legislator who doesn't agree with, like, oh yeah, we need to invest in student and educator mental health. And so how do we forge that divide, I would say, given that the policymaking process is a difficult one, and what happens next?
Yeah, so I think we all still have an opportunity to reach out to our elected officials and let them know that we still have concerns about this bill. Here's the thing, right? Everyone who is in the Capitol is elected. So that means they respond to people like you and I. So if they are getting enough pressure that people still care about little kids, they still care about homeless youth, they still care about how these added pressures are going to disproportionately impact young people, I think there's a real opportunity to really influence how the floor vote goes at the end of September.
All right, LaShawn Francis, Director of Behavioral Health at Children Now. LaShawn, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an honor to have you here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Hopefully we'll have some good news near the tail end of this legislative session where it comes to this particular piece of legislation. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And folks, if you like what you've seen here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, we invite you to join us as a subscriber on YouTube or like us on Facebook. If you do, you'll get instant alerts when we're about to come on live on the air with breaking news, or when we have our regularly scheduled ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. So go ahead and subscribe to us. Also, if you have great stories happening in your school communities, we want to tell your stories. Go ahead and send in your talking points, your photos, your news releases to our great EdCal editor, Michelle Carl, at mcarl@acsa.org. Also want to remind you folks, coming up here in November, first week of November, it's the ACSA Leadership Summit in Sacramento. Take a look. And that is ACSA's Leadership Summit, November 2nd through 4th here in Sacramento. You don't want to miss it. For information registration, go to acsa.org/professional-learning. Edgar, I do want to just summarize the discussion we had with LaShawn about this modernization plan, as the administration is calling it. Obviously, we have the mental health piece of this, but at least for lawmakers, something that is very public is the situation with the unhoused population and how they have to address that, because that is a problem not just in our large urban cities, but also in our smaller communities and our rural communities. As you heard LaShawn, was there something that really kind of hit you as far as, hey, perhaps lawmakers aren't looking the way they should be looking when it comes to student mental health, children's mental health?
Yeah, and it's difficult, because I think the one piece that was a big takeaway for me, it's a reminder of how challenging some of these conversations are when you're talking about bills and policy. It's like, bottom line is, none of us are going to disagree that homelessness is a problem that we need to address. And that's how it's being pitched to the policymakers. Now, and we're often in this position where we have to talk about unintended consequences. This is not a place where we want to go to be like, hey, not to say that we don't direct dollars, but at what expense? So I think it's just in that vote that we talked about, and even she talked that there's some courtesy vote, but sometimes this could be an uphill battle of how do we forge that that fine line of saying, yes, we're addressing this, but let's make sure, and especially in an era that we have increasingly diminishing resources. Now, mind you, there's a little bit of good news. We'll probably talk about that next week about what the LAO is saying on the revenue front. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, right now, I think we're all worried about money, that all those days of us having excess resources aren't there. So when that happens, it's opportunity cost. They're saying, well, here's a pot of money here that maybe we just expand the use. But usually if you expand the use, that's going to be at the expense of something else. Namely, in this case, when we're talking about student mental health and funds that could go support our schools.
Yeah, certainly something. I mean, obviously, we've proven that we've been keeping up on that. We certainly will continue to keep up on that. I do see Deanna is on here on our chat today, Edgar. So we are going to. She's the biggest college football fan, at least that I know, on this show. But for our viewers, feel free to tell me, no, you're a bigger college football fan. But we'll have the opportunity maybe next time to talk about the college football season. Want to just bring this back to you, Edgar, because, well, we have to, because Grant Bennett helped us out on this. We showed last week our throwback photo. I think this is like 2017 or something like that. You and I doing our budget breakdown. I don't even remember the year. You and I just looked so much younger back then. But Grant Bennett, the great superintendent in Paris Unified, your former superintendent, of course, sent that photo in. I'm so happy that nobody connected with my academic years in a school district watches the show, or else I suspect that a number of photos would be coming our way, or our crack staff in the back would be trying to figure out how to get photos of me over here.
Well, challenge accepted, Naj. I've been lobbying my old friend there, Grant Bennett. I don't know. I think maybe I'm gonna have to use. I'm gonna test what authority, and you're gonna keep the picture up. Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm gonna have to see what authority I have to kind of put an end to this here. But because of that, Naj, okay, you put it out there.
Yeah,
I don't care if it's your former teachers or old, friends or just ACSA members. I'm sure we've caught in less than Naj in less than flattering poses. Send them across. I know we'll accept them. I know Gianna and Michael would be more than happy to accept any pictures, or just maybe we now just need to be on the lookout. When you see Naj not paying attention at a conference or whatnot, opportunity to get some content here for the legislative lunch break. So let's see. I'm looking forward to this. I'm sure we're gonna get something good here. Pictures, please.
I'm assuming somebody here will take up the challenge. The good thing is that Edgar and I have learned very well not to be standing next to each other very often at these conferences, because we get mistaken for each other all the time. Folks, thanks so much for being with us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Remember, we are live and interactive Wednesdays here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.